Welcome to another episode of Inflection. I am Brian Berletic. Joining me, as always, is Angelo Giuliano. Today, we're going to be talking about Russia's ongoing military operations in Ukraine. We're going to talk about what's going on the ground there, at least what we can see and hear from both sides. And then we're going to talk about how the West has just completely lost its mind. It's completely lost its mind. I have never seen things. I've been doing this for over 10 years. Angelo, you've been paying attention to politics for even longer than that, I think. This is the craziest we've ever seen it. I'm in Thailand. Angelo, you are in Switzerland right now. Tell us how it's going in Switzerland. What is the atmosphere like there?
Well, it's very shocking. Historically, Switzerland was always neutral. Just going back to World War II, even when there was Hitler, Switzerland was completely neutral. Now, for the first time in Swiss history, they're taking side. Clearly taking side. They've banned RT. There's so much going on, and it's extremely shocking. It's going all the way. I think, I see the Western world being extremely emotional. And when you're getting emotional, it means that you're not controlling. You're losing. What is happening in Ukraine, if you look at the scale of what is happening in Ukraine, we're talking about, hundreds of deaths. And every death, of course, war is bad. It shouldn't happen. But look at what is happening in Yemen and all the other wars. Why why the West is panicking so much? Well, it's very simple. This is a big humiliation. It's a big humiliation because usually, it's the West bullying, and here you have the globalist agenda there is a huge setback. They have invested so much money into Ukraine, and now you have someone that actually stood up. He's actually using the same language as NATO, because NATO, the only language they understand is force. So the thing is that Putin had no choice. War was unavoidable. So when unavoidable. So when war is unavoidable, what do? You strike first. And everything makes obvious. When you look at, always Ukraine, go back to 2014, everything that happened since then. Well, I think Russia and Putin, they knew that was the ultimate outcome. Unavoidable outcome was war.
Yeah, absolutely. And people have to remember, this did not start last week. This started in 2014 when the United States overthrew the elected government of Ukraine. The government, however flawed that it was, represented the complex balance inside of Ukraine and the complex balance outside of Ukraine between Russia to the east and the EU and NATO and the United States to the west. And Ukraine was playing a delicate but successful balancing act. And the US came in there and deliberately pushed them off the tightrope. And Ukraine has been falling ever since. We watched them install a government into power that the United States handpicked. They were caught on tape saying this, handpicking the regime that they installed into power. They took right-wing elements, Nazis, essentially, literal Nazis. So let's not mince words here, Nazis into the security apparatus. And I have spent all week arguing with people, trying to make excuses as if only 1 or 2% are Nazis, so it's not a big deal. If a government knowingly is employing Nazis in their own armed formations, in their armed forces, officially, these aren't fringe groups, paramilitary groups. These are part of Ukraine's armed forces. The entire government is complicit. The entire government is a Nazi government. There's no way to defend this. And in this, you see people like really struggling and saying outrageous things to try to defend this, because there is this huge propaganda campaign across the West, sweeping people up. It's a trend. It's a bandwagon effect. Everyone is being swept along. If you're not going along with this, it's like being surrounded by a horde of zombies. I just want to show people some. Let's see if I can see some examples of this right here. And this is all from the Western media. 2 orchestras fire Russian conductor for supporting Putin. So this man, a Russian who refuses to condemn his nation and his president, he has lost his job conducting an orchestra as if his political proclivities had any impact on his job performance. This is the West that claims that they're all about freedom and protecting free speech and political ideas, no matter how unpopular. And here they just threw this man out of his job because he refused to condemn Russia for reacting to a crisis the US and Europe created 8 years ago. And this war that's going on, and Angelo, you've mentioned this many times before, this war has been going on for 8 years. The Ukrainian government, installed into power by the US, has been waging relentless war against eastern Ukraine, the Donbas region. 14,000 people have died. That includes everyone on both sides, and over 3,000 civilians. And this was something that was not going to stop. There were all kinds of deals and talks and agreements that were signed that Kiev was not honoring. And why should they honor it? They have the United States backing them and granting them impunity. They literally have Nazis running around in their armed forces, and the US is still backing them, sending them weapons, and trying to keep this conflict going for as long as possible. Angelo, you were talking about Switzerland. Let's talk about what's going on in Thailand. Thailand has actually a pretty close relationship with Russia. There's not that much trade, but there are certain areas of cooperation that is significant. For example, the Thai government has begun replacing some of their aging U.S. military equipment with Russian alternatives, mostly Chinese, but also some Russian alternatives. And this includes helicopters, and so there is this relationship that's ongoing, and the prime minister openly said Thailand will remain neutral. They're not going to join sides. They're following China's lead, as a matter of fact. And I want to show you this article from Bangkok Post. This is neutral on Russia-Ukraine prime minister. And then they talk about this. 25 envoys urge Thai to condemn invasion. So you have these, let's see if they got a picture of these. Let me see if I can find it. But what it is basically is these rich white Western countries who have been meddling in Thailand's internal political affairs for years and years, putting violent mobs out into the streets, trying to overthrow the government, overthrow the monarchy, and turn Thailand into another Ukraine. Now they're demanding that Thailand take their side to fully help push Ukraine through the wood chipper that they fed Ukraine into. It's horrific. And the gall, the audacity of these diplomats, these envoys, to sit there and lecture Thailand in their own country on how they should react to this situation that the West themselves committed. Let me find this. There's a lot of things that are going on that are just driving me absolutely crazy. The audacity. Let me see if I can find it. Angelo, go ahead while I look for this.
Well, Brian, just look at how many people are supporting Ukraine, protesting against this war in the Global South. There is literally no one, because the Global South is no fool. This is the rich countries, and this is an imperialistic war. And it's ultimately, when you're hitting Russia and China, you're hitting the Global South, because they are the hope for the world, for a multipolar world. You know, if somehow US imperialism is defeated, well, it's going to give room for decolonization and stopping the oppression of the Global South. They're no fool. And then just look at I think that it's extremely important to look at the vote at the UN sanctioning Russia. I mean, there's so much information telling you about who's siding, who's not. And you have countries like supposedly allies of the US that don't want to take side. India, sorry, doesn't want to condemn. You even have a EU member and NATO member that doesn't want to condemn. Hungary. So there's when you look at the condemnation, they come from the rich countries. Vassal states. Where they planted U.S. puppets regime.
Absolutely. You could get a drink of water, Angelo. No worries. We're not. This isn't extremely formal. We're just kind of working our way through all of this. This is the tweet from David Daly, ambassador extraordinary and whatever of the European Union, and this is him lecturing Thai people in Thailand about where they should stand on the Ukraine. The audacity and the explicit racism of these rich white nations still in the year 2022 acting as if whatever they say, if you're not following that, if your interests are at cross purposes with theirs, somehow you're wrong, you're barbaric, you're uncivilized. This is still going on in 2022. This is them in Bangkok, in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, posing for this picture with all these flags, just like you said, Angelo, the colonialists and their little vassals, like Japan there hosting tens of thousands of US troops in their own territory, never regained their sovereignty. And then, of course, the UK and the US, last but not least. And these are all the same countries, the colonialist countries. They're all the same ones back in 2019. This is a picture of all of them going down to the police station with this billionaire, Thanathorn Ruangruangkit. He's the billionaire opposition leader that the US wants in power, who is openly anti-China, who is openly anti-Russia, and will do anything that Washington tells him to do. They said, go cancel the high-speed railway and advocate for Hyperloop, which doesn't even exist. And he went and he tried to do that. And so this is all of those same people now lecturing Thailand on Ukraine. This is all of them holding his hand while they go down to the police station, interfering blatantly in Thailand's internal political affairs. And the foreign minister slams diplomats for accompanying Thanathorn. And so the Ministry of Foreign Affairs actually had to come out and condemn this. And so there's this dichotomy in Thailand. The current situation right now is all of the US-backed or funded media are obviously backing the US on this. And then most Thai media is neutral. And then you also have a corner of Thai media that has been covering this very positively and more truthfully than not. We even had a prominent media personality here in Thailand go to the Russian embassy in January and interview the Russian ambassador to Thailand. That will be in the video description below. You can watch that. It's in Thai and also English. And they're allowing Russia to have their side of the story told. And who's not allowing Russia's side of the story to be told? Well, let me just tie this up here. They make this look like a massive protest. There's like 10 or 20 people there. And it's just, again, creative photography trying to inflate this crowd. It's some Ukrainian expats, and it's the US-backed opposition whose own protests collapsed. And so there's really no prospect of this growing any bigger than this in Thailand. But what they're trying to do is pressure the Thai government to do what the rich white nations told Thailand to do, is to get in line behind them. So that we will see this in Thailand and in other countries that refuse to side with the West. Here is Suthichai. I've talked about them many times. Very predictably, they are siding with the US and condemning Russia and giving none of the backgrounds, none of the context, pretending that Russia is the first country in modern history to carry out any sort of military operation against another country, as if the US has been minding its business all of this time, and it isn't behind the Ukraine crisis in the first place. And I want to just remind people that Chiranut Premchaiporn, she is the director of Suthichai. She is also a fellow at the National Endowment for Democracy, just to show you how compromised and transparent this whole agenda is. There's nothing genuine about this at all. And the US has stood up pockets of opposition like this in every single country around the globe. So when you see this global reaction, this is the media focusing on these people that they've funded and created and acting as if they represent the world and represent the people in these countries like Thailand, when in no shape, form, or way they don't. And so Angelo, in Europe, RT is being censored. In Thailand, it has not been censored. I don't think that it will be. YouTube might unilaterally decide to do it on their own against Thailand's wishes or interests. And this is why every nation needs to treat their information space like sovereign territory. Angelo, is there anything you want to jump in and say before we move on?
Well, you and I, we are anti-war. I mean, of course, I mean, violence is wrong. But you see those people coming out anti-war. I'm asking them, I mean, do they realize that this war has started 8 years ago? What happened is you have 2 million people that were living in basements because they were being shelled, bombed on a daily basis. 14,000 people died. It's important to understand that Putin, it's not an invasion of Russia. Russia is coming over to save Ukrainians. There is a civil war going on there, and you have Russians in Ukraine being bombed. 14,000 people died. So those people that are calling themselves pacifists, I'm asking them, where were you 8 years ago? The last 8 years? Because lives have been destroyed. You know, Poroshenko used to call the Russians in Donbass dogs. He said, we are going to give schools, education to our kids. They won't. We are going to give pensions to our people. They won't. So, and then additional to that, there was a cultural genocide going on. I mean, we are talking about eradication of the whole Russian culture. I mean, when you look at history, I mean, Ukraine has been always part of China. Actually, even Kiev used to be
part of Russia.
Part of Russia,
yeah, you said
and
part
the
of China.
You know, sorry, it was a capital of Russia. So you see, there's so much misunderstanding. I mean, you know, I mean, it's some is it's because of ignorance, but some is just propaganda because it serves the imperialistic narrative.
Absolutely. And Russia could have went to war 8 years ago, and they didn't. They waited 8 years. They did everything possible to try to avoid this. And you're seeing even across the Western media in the past, before this hysteria set in, people were openly and repeatedly for years and years and years saying that if you continue expanding NATO, there will be a war, because NATO's own agenda, and they have said this a million times, and it's in all of their policy papers. People like Damon Wilson, now heading the National Endowment for Democracy, when he was at the Atlantic Council, which is basically a NATO think tank, the public face of NATO, he said that the goal is to incorporate all of Europe and then eventually Russia. This is existential. This is for Russia. That's how they see it, and how could they not see it? You have to remember, in the 1990s and early 2000s, there was the Chechen wars, where the U.S. was sponsoring militancy inside of Russian territory, and they almost lost that region, and they fought 2 wars to get it back. And so this is real for Russia. This isn't Russia being paranoid or imagining things. They have been under siege since the fall of the Soviet Union. The US and the UK and Europe had tried to go in there and plunder the country. They were pushed out, and now they're trying to encircle, contain, and do it again. And this is unacceptable. This is unacceptable. No country would be expected to just sit there and wait for this to happen. And I like to compare it to someone kicking in your door and they just start killing everyone in your family. Think about the people in Donbass as ethnic Russians right on Russia's doorstep, right on the border. That is happening, and you know that they're going to come for you next. Do you sit there and do you wait for them to cross the border into your country before you do something? Just like you said, Angela, warfare is inevitable. Strike first. This is modern warfare. Whoever strikes first has the initiative. It's just it's a cruel fact that people have to understand, that you cannot sit there and say, oh, what about international law? What about international law in regards to what the West has done for decades? You're in a lawless system, a rules-based international order that the U.S. dominates and makes the rules up as they go along and selectively enforces them or ignores them to its own advantage. How do you operate and protect yourself in that system if not by force? Ultimately by force, when no other option is available. So I really don't even see how it's complicated for people to. You don't have to be enthusiastic about war, but you have to support a war where the country had no other choice, and they're fighting for their existence against an enemy that has already erased multiple nations off the map. Libya wiped off the map, Afghanistan wiped off the map, Iraq clinging to existence, Syria clinging to existence, all because of the US, all because of these nations in NATO. They were all responsible for that. They were doing this incrementally closer and closer and closer to Russia until it was going to be Russia's turn. Russia doesn't have to sit there, and neither does China. So we've talked about Russia. Let me see before I go too crazy here. Let's do this. Let's do this one.
There's so much to cover. But
yeah.
I just want to add, I mean, Brian, NATO accession of Ukraine. I mean, I think Ukraine was already de facto part of NATO. Just because of the shipping of arms, the funding into the defense. They were building a port this part, the Azov Sea,
right here,
how important is this port to, this area to Russia? Russia doesn't have access. The only access to warm seas are through this channel. So if you cut that, you have only, like cold seas, and it's so essential. It's been existential threat for a long time, for hundreds of years, even before, when we had the USSR. So it is important to see that they were, and this port was built by NATO. So NATO was already, threatening just right there at the door of Russia. At some point, you say, for years and years, you say, stop. We have a problem there. Stop. Donbass, every year, there was a Minsk agreement. Every year, Putin would go to the NATO and say, well, we have a problem. We have to solve that. And Ukraine is not respecting Minsk agreement. How many times you have to say it? How many times? And at some point, he had to strike. He had to strike. What is it? And this is the only, sadly, this is the only language that NATO understands. Because NATO countries and the West, when you look at all the what is happening at the UN, how many times did they respect, conventions, treaties? The US actually signs treaties, but always breaks them, all the time.
Okay, so if you read through this article and like the Western media, when I show you a Western media article, I'm not saying that this is the whole truth and nothing but the truth. I'm showing you that even the West mentioned this, and when you read the article, they're going to try to downplay it completely. But if you were, let's say this was reversed, let's say Russia and China were building new ports or repairing naval bases in Canada or Mexico, the hysteria and the frothing madness that would be coming out of Washington. China is rumored to be doing something in Cambodia, thousands and thousands of miles from U.S. shores on the other side of the Pacific, and the U.S. still has a problem with that. And this was the U.S. and NATO building a base in Ukraine. It doesn't matter how big or small. They're trying to argue that it was so small it didn't matter.
Okay, can I add
a foothold that you? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, even worse. The example here. If you look at the distances. This army base would be the same as having a Russian army base in Tijuana. Tijuana, you know what it is. It's like San Diego. You just drive 1 hour and you are in Mexico. This army base was just at the border, not even inside Ukraine, Kiev. Also, it was right there at the border, and naval routes. So imagine having a blockade at your doors, those attacks. You have NATO attacks, but I'm not even mentioning the attacks they have when they're trying to do regime change. Because again, what is happening right now? The sanctions. Why the sanctions? They're hoping to have a regime change in Russia. That's the purpose of. They want to show the economy, to make the economy scream. The same as they've tried with Iran, with Cuba, with Venezuela. It's repeating that, but this time they're putting everything they have, in terms of weapons. But you know what? Sometimes it's a weapon because you're not using it. When you use all your weapons, then you have nothing left. They're even using SWIFT, which is actually going to backfire. And who's going to suffer? Mostly it's going to be the EU. EU is going to suffer so much. So you see, it's antagonizing EU and Russia, and the US is going to watch. It's going to watch that from the distance.
Yeah, I just want to point out in this article, I just want people to decide for themselves what they think, because in this article, they're saying it's absolutely not a NATO base, even though the US is building it. They're saying that the U.S. forces built several buildings here. Again, what if China or Russia were building several buildings in Canada or Mexico? Washington would go ballistic. It would be an act of war, and we would be doing the Cuban Missile Crisis all over again. Among them are so-called Maritime Operations Center, which he described as a small building. Doesn't matter how big or small it is. a boat maintenance facility, and a building to store the 5 Willards, which Ukrainian media described as intended for use by special forces on stealthy missions, which could be anything and could have catastrophic security implications for Russia. It's unacceptable. The US would not accept it. Russia is not expected to accept it. So there was that. And they're saying, well, it was so small, but that's what NATO has been doing all along, incrementally, step by step, base by base, encircling and containing Russia. And with people in NATO and the Atlantic Council, this adjacent civilian think tank, saying that eventually the goal is to incorporate, absorb Russia. So it was a direct threat to Russia's survival. And not even like its interest, its actual survival. So this is why one of the many reasons Russia is in Ukraine right now. Now, we've been hearing a lot of rumors, and let's start putting them to rest by, again, citing the Western media itself. We heard all of these stories about Zelensky, President Zelensky in Ukraine saying, we're going to get all these jets, we're going to get all of these weapons. And he's not really understanding that no matter how many weapons you send to Ukraine, if your logistics are cut off, and if no one is willing to pick them up, then they're just static hardware, just like in Syria. This is what Russia had to face in Syria, and they did so successfully. This is the same we see in Ukraine. And Russia is not bogged down by the logistical constraints that it has in Syria. So this is a totally different dimension. And this is the West. I mean, again, it's too early to tell, but I have never seen them this disjointed, incoherent, and hysterical. And so this is EU countries won't send Ukraine fighter jets after all. Yes, no kidding. There were just so many complications to this. Russia, like we were just saying, like Russia is not going to sit there and say, okay, what do you guys got? You got the jet parked? You guys all set up and ready to go? Okay, let's go. Let's fight. Let's get back to fighting. No, they're not going to let that plane take off. So what would the point be to give them jets? And then if you're going to operate jets out of, say, Poland, this is so dangerous. You're basically involved in the war once you start doing that. So I mean, it's just too risky, too complicated, and even then, what difference is it going to make? Angelo, what do you think about that? And are there any other rumors that you want to lay to rest here?
It is so irrational. I mean, you see, I mean, they want to have a quick access to, I mean, Ukraine quick access to EU. I mean, what does it mean? It would mean, there's a similar Article 5 for the EU. So now, if Russia was at war with Ukraine, then it would mean that all the EU would have to join. Then, they're talking about a no-fly zone. Zelensky is asking, why don't you install a no-fly zone over Ukraine? You know what it means? NATO, if they do that, it's a war declaration. You want to send jets, but who's gonna fly those jets? Not Ukrainians. But those are de facto war declarations. When there's a Ministry of Finance France, he's saying we are going to do a total war on the economy of Russia. When you start an economic war, it turns into a real hot war. It's just becoming irrational. The thing is that it's a competition. It's a competition of posture. It's a beauty contest. Whoever is the most anti-Russian, and to create the buzz, you have the media, and then the politicians. It's completely irrational. It's not well thought. I mean, overnight, overnight you don't want to, you ban Russian flights to Europe. Well, Russia is banning its airspace. So now people that want to go from London to Tokyo, what do? You have to cross. You are going to spend 5 more hours to go to Tokyo. It's hitting oneself on the foot. And the ultimate weapon, Europe needs to be extremely careful. I doubt Russia will do it. But if they cut the gas, what do? It's absurd. It's completely absurd.
Yeah, I just saw someone in the comment section say, how can there be, I've heard this a million times, but they were asking it, I think in goodwill, how could there be a Jewish president in Ukraine and have Nazis running around? Well, I mean, just think back to World War II. There was an endless list of Jewish collaborators working hand in hand with the Nazis. Just being Jewish is not a cloak of invincibility that keeps your soul and your conscience pure of Nazism. It just isn't that way.
Well,
Ukraine has a serious Nazi problem deep within its institutional structures, is completely infected. Angelo.
Yeah. Well, we can take the example of the U.S. electing a black president, right? I mean, you're living in a country which is, I mean, see how they treat blacks in America. They managed to elect a black president, so it's pretty much the same. You have collaborators. It's the same as the slave of the house that used to look down at the slave that was in the field. It's the same. You are going to, if you pay them well, you are going, or if they have advantages, you are going to be, they are corrupted. You can corrupt them. And Zelensky, I mean, it's extremely important. There's one thing that I want to mention. Zelensky is hostage in many ways, but there's an entity is OCCRP. It's the entity that actually discovered. I mean, supposedly discovered the Pandora Papers. I mean, behind this is the NED, CIA, George Soros Foundation, and they exposed Zelensky offshore accounts last year. So you have to ask yourself, why this happened last year? So now you could imagine that Zelensky is being completely hostage. Why would any CIA entity expose Zelensky a year ago? And keep in mind that Zelensky came into power with two promises. One was peace, and the second one was to fight corruption. And the next thing we found out is that Zelensky has offshore accounts. He has a mansion in London. You see, he's extremely rich. And my guess is Zelensky is going to become the next Juan Guaido. Because once this is all over, there is they stop the war in Ukraine and they sort out and they bring back democracy, because there's no democracy now. They bring back democracy in Ukraine, then you are going to have a puppet regime outside of Ukraine, and Ukraine will not be recognized. That's what's going to happen. That's the next step. Zelensky is this clown is the next Juan Guaido.
Yeah, and I just want to point out that they got Zelensky. He's literally an actor. They got him for his acting credentials. That he ran on a campaign on a platform that appealed to Ukrainians because they're sick of what the government is actually doing. The people keep pointing out the Nazis are incredibly unpopular. It's true, they're incredibly unpopular, and yet they're a central pillar of Ukraine's security apparatus. And they are backed by the entire regime in Kiev. They get their budget, their marching orders, and their armaments from Kiev. This makes everyone complicit in that. And so when you have a regime like that is answering to Washington, not to the people of Ukraine, and it's been a captured state since 2014. And when you have that, you're going to do this democracy facade, you have to have a guy that can talk the talk, but that will never be allowed to walk the walk. And this is exactly what Obama did. This is exactly what Trump did. They all fed people what they wanted to hear. And once they got into power, it went right back to the way it was, or worse, which is the case in Ukraine. It got many times worse. I just want to just put a pin in this whole Nazi thing. This is not Russia saying this. This is even the Western media. This is Reuters all the way back in 2015. All the way back as far as 2015, the unit was already 1,000 strong. It is much larger now, and it was already part of Ukraine's National Guard, and officially part of Ukraine's National Guard. And people might have heard on Twitter the official account of Ukraine's National Guard featuring Azov fighters. These are Nazis with weapons, arms, and backed by Kiev. It's not a paramilitary unit. It is officially part of Ukraine's National Guard. And they were dipping bullets into pork lard to shoot at Muslim soldiers within the Russian military. And this is an Islamophobic death threat. Now, okay, you can claim that your country is under invasion and you're defending yourself, but now you're introducing this animosity, this racism, this Islamophobia that has nothing to do with defending your country, and you're linking these people in your country to all over 1 billion Muslims around the world. You're offending and mocking and threatening them as well, and offending them as well when you do that. And it's no surprise. This is what Russia was warning people about all along since 2014. It turns out Russia was telling the truth. And I hear this all the time. I don't want to carry water for Russia. But if Russia is telling the truth, then what you're saying is you would rather lie than face the truth. And this is part of the insanity that has gripped much of the West, that's just completely off. Though I will argue with people for an hour, and they will do everything in their power to defend literal Nazis. Doing percentages, doing mathematics to try to it's just a percentage of this and that. It's like, do people realize that the SS, the Waffen SS in World War II is like 5% of the German army? Most German soldiers were not committed Nazis. But that doesn't matter. It's this toxic ideology. If the government, the central government, feels the need to employ people like this, then it is a government that does not deserve to exist. It doesn't matter if there's 500, 5,000. It doesn't matter. And so if you catch yourself making excuses for Nazis to defend a narrative told to you by the same people who told you Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, you might want to think about that. You might want to think that one over. You might just be on the wrong side of history. Angelo, anything else you want to talk about regarding the literal Nazis that are part of Ukraine's official armed forces?
Well, I'm clear about this. I mean, people that they're trying so much to whitewash those neo-Nazis. Actually, you even have Netflix that actually bought some copyrights of movies that are made about those neo-Nazis movement in Ukraine. Those guys, and even some actors were Azov battalion. Can you imagine? And why the purpose to whitewash? How can we make them cool? Under the this coolness of being gangsters. Those gangsters, how you turn them to be cool, and that's what they want to do. Is they are going to brainwash the West on those movements being kind of cool, because it's freedom. They are neo-Nazi, but it is okay because it's for freedom, it's for democracy. So it's fine to have neo-Nazis. I want to add one thing, and extremely important, and this is touching China. People need to pay attention. They need to be extremely careful, because what happened in Ukraine can happen with Taiwan. The parallel is Zelensky and Tsai Ing-wen. Tsai Ing-wen, she's the president. She's part of the DPP, Democratic Progressive Party. She's a U.S. puppet. We talked about this. She had a secret meeting with AIT, which is de facto U.S. embassy in Taiwan since 2004. So they propped her up. She was in Times Magazine, the Person of the Year, and so on. I mean, she's the hero. She's the Aung San Suu Kyi for Taiwan, and she's basically listening to the U.S. Now you have NATO delegation that is going to Taiwan these days. So what are they going to try to do with Tsai Ing-wen is push her for independence. They are going to try to do that. And there's two red lines. The same as Putin had red lines for Russia, China has red lines for Taiwan. No independence. That's, this is the red line. Second thing, very careful, nuclear capabilities. There's a risk. They did try, they started talking about this for Ukraine. He had that when he was in Munich, he started saying, all along he was saying, oh, we are thinking about having nuclear capabilities. And there was not a single country president that said, wait, stop. You cannot do that. Nuclear proliferation, you cannot do that. So the risk that we might have actually at some point, China striking first. If Tsai Ing-wen, she goes nuts as Zelensky did, then I think for the first time in my life, I'm thinking that there's a real possibility of Chinese invasion. I mean, not invasion, getting back Taiwan. It is risky. We are, and here we might have two fronts. And it's the replica of World War II. Remember, we had two fronts, World War II. We might have two fronts again, And this is why they did try to have alliance. AUKUS, they tried to have, they went all around Asian countries to say, we have to fight China. So an alliance there, and they tried an alliance with Europe.
Yeah, I think it's so important to point out the parallel. I mean, it's not even parallels between Ukraine and Taiwan. This is directly linked in the mind of Washington. This is part of one large campaign of encirclement and containment of Eurasia, basically, Russia and China. This is a collective strategy. Every single policy paper about China mentions Russia, and every paper about Russia mentions China, and they're doing the exact same thing in both places. There's an illegitimate regime in both places, in Ukraine and Taiwan. They are militarizing both, while they were militarizing Ukraine until recently. And I just want to show people that there are U.S. troops on Taiwan. This is a place where, if you look at the U.S. State Department's official website, their stance on Taiwan is that it is part of China, or they recognize that China sees it as part of their own territory. Either way, whichever way you want to try to interpret that, it's a blatant provocation. It is an act of war, and the U.S. would never tolerate it if it was the other way around. And here is China patiently suffering this indignity imposed on them by the U.S. And this is a continuation of the racist, rampant imperialism that China had dealt with during the 100 years of humiliation. And it's still going on. And you see Washington pushing the buttons, hoping that Beijing makes an emotional decision instead of a rational decision. And this is where we are on that front. And we see where we are on the front, the Russian front, with NATO and the U.S. And people just got to stop and think, just very basically, why is the U.S. involved at all? It's on the other side of the Atlantic. On the other side of the Atlantic, they have to cross all of Europe to get to Ukraine. Why are they involved? Why are they the brokers here between Ukraine and Russia? No one seems to even notice that. They just take it for granted that the U.S. is everywhere, involved in everything. And then at the same time, they will accuse you of, oh, you say the U.S. is behind everything. But they are. I mean, they openly are. And here at Taiwan, the U.S. has troops in Taiwan. Why? Why do they do that? Why do they have that? And so we see who the problem is. Every crisis we look at, everything is different except one thing: the U.S. is involved. And then the opposition that the U.S. cultivates is very similar from place to place. So there's almost no way to distinguish them except for their names and their ethnicity. But they're doing everything exactly the same, using the same language, this fake democracy that the U.S. is pushing everywhere as a system of control, not as a system of self-determination. It is. And so look at the racism, look at the paranoia, the hysteria surrounding this current conflict between the West and Russia and how it's playing out in Ukraine. And then when they pivot this toward Russia, depending on the outcome of what happens in Ukraine, when they pivot all of this toward China, and look at how Russians are being attacked, targeted, abused across the Western world, it's going to be 1,000 times worse for China. And I think every single country that is caught in between this better wake up and realize that this is not the time to sit there and try to play both sides. If you think that that's the best way to avoid this, but if you understand what's coming and how final it is if the West is able to pull this off, and how miserable your life will be, and how all of the progress you made during your generation will be erased overnight. It really is time for people to start uniting and stop being ambiguous about things. Like if you say you support Russia, stand with Russia, doesn't mean you like seeing people dying in war. But if there ever was a just war fought in the 21st century, this would have to be won. Definitely not Iraq or Afghanistan or any of these other, like the U.S. is, and the media, just the hysteria over Russia doing something that's actually justified for a change when the U.S. has waged these serial wars of aggression. It's unreal. It's surreal. And it just goes to show you what Angela and I have been talking about this for a long time, warning people that the U.S. wants hegemony. They want to reassert themselves. They will not accept China surpassing them. And taking Russia off the board is part of stopping China from surpassing them. And we have said many times they will do virtually anything to stop China, including things you would never imagine they would even consider. They would do it. People say they will never do a conventional war with China. They will. They're already planning it. I guarantee you, we will see something. We will see something before it's all said and done. Angelo?
Yeah, I think the racism, it's extremely important. We saw racism in Western media. I mean, they exposed, it's so blatant. I mean, so obvious. When they are saying, well, Ukrainians are being bombed, Ukrainians are like you and me. They have blonde hair, they have blue eyes, they are like you and me. They are not third world countries. I mean, monkeys or what? I mean, what are they? Yemenis have the same value, that their lives are the same as anyone. So, it's exposing, it's exposing the races behind this. Well, you know what? They're killing civilized people that are white people. They are not third world countries people, like in Yemen or Afghanistan. Those guys are like you and me. So you see, it's showing very clearly that those people, they do not value the lives of the global south or other countries, and you've seen, I mean, how many years? I mean, the last 30 years, all the movies, whenever they were picturing Russians, it was always like low IQ, violent prostitutes. I mean, really, and you get this racist. It starts from the movies, and it's in the psyche of people. And people are Pavlovian. They have reptilian mind. Now it's like you say Russia, and they say bad. You say China, they say bad. It's binary. It's just reptilian. The Pavlov dog, when he heard the bell, he would salivate. It's the same now. You start talking to people, Russia. Oh, Putin is a sick man. Is Hitler. I mean, do you know? I mean, what Putin has done to Russia? What the West wanted for Russia was a Yeltsin, a drunkard. The guy was drunk, completely corrupted, and he sold his country to the oligarch and to the US. And now, actually, Russia is, the last 20 years with Putin, has been regaining its dignity. And it's the same as China. Those countries are trying to regain their dignity. China has suffered 100 years of humiliation. Taiwan is the last piece to completely regain that dignity. But the West doesn't want that. And they're desperate. This is that they're really desperate, because now you have Russia and China, and they're facing, and they're using the same language. They could be diplomatic up to a certain point. How many times, they cheated. Libya, they went along, they were cheated, It was not about regime change. Why? It was not the goal to overthrow the government. They say no-fly zone. They cheated. And when it started, I think really when it started, like having Russia facing the West, was in Syria. They had a long-term partnership, this friendship that dated back in the USSR. And they said, no, this time stops. And I think this is when the West really decided, we have to attack Russia.
Absolutely. I think that's really important to get into. We'll try to end this at 1 hour instead of 3 hours, like the last episode. But that was extenuating circumstances. Syria is really important to point out. Again, if you look at a map and you look at the advance of U.S. interests across the map, which is basically just the creation of a swath of death and destruction spanning continents. That is what the U.S. does. And the Arab Spring, and how they were dividing and destroying one nation after the other. And when you learn that the U.S. had been preparing for that years in advance, arming, training, equipping both militants and activists as part of this alternative network that they set up everywhere, and to put them into place to try to seize power when there's an opportunity. They did all of that, and you watched Libya fall. And I don't think Russia was naive and thought that, they're not going to do regime change in Libya. They knew it, but Russia is not all powerful. China is not all powerful. At that time, Russia had absolutely no ability to go and save Libya. It was impossible. And this was just a loss that they had to accept. It sounds very cynical, but when you're adding up everything and you're playing a chess game, there are certain pieces that you just cannot save unless you just want to give up the whole game. And so come Syria, just think about look at Syria on a map. After Syria is Iran. After Iran, you have a channel, a direct land bridge from all of these psychopaths that they have radicalized and armed, a land bridge right into southern Russia, right into Chechnya for a third Chechen war. That was what Russia was facing. Again, existential threats to Russia itself, not some game that they're playing to preserve their interests like the US is doing all around the globe. This was existential. And so they entered into Syria. You saw their military footprint is not that big. And what they started doing was bombing the supply lines going to ISIS. And their fighting capacity collapsed, and Syrian Arab army was able to get the upper hand. All of those weapons that, again, you can send as many weapons as you want into a country, but if they can't get to the battlefield and there's no one left to pick them up and use them, then it's useless. And this is what Russia did in Syria. And so this is why the West and this theory they have of just dumping weapons into Ukraine, this is going to prolong the conflict, yes, but it is not a solution. And what they're doing is there's a fire, just like China says, it's a fire and you're just pouring fuel on the fire. You're not trying to put it out. You started it and now you're putting gasoline on it as Russia is going in there to deal with it. So there's all of that. Again, Syria was directly connected to the self-preservation of Russia. If it were to fall, there was going to be next Iraq and Iran. And then there was a direct path right into southern, because you have Georgia and all of these countries that would have been a party to aiding and abetting the U.S. And remember, right before Ukraine, it's like a peacekeeping mission that Russia led into Kazakhstan, where the U.S. was also doing exactly to Kazakhstan what they did to Ukraine in 2014. This was a sign that Russia was drawing lines, and it was going to stomp this out immediately. It wasn't going to play it by ear any longer. And then this needs to happen. This needs to happen. If this was happening in, say, Southeast Asia, everyone just got together as soon as one of these U.S.-backed operations started. If everyone just mobilized the media and security to stop it before it even ended up in extreme violence, it would be such a boost to peace and prosperity, because both are predicated on stability. And this is what the U.S. has been doing, destabilizing. You cannot compete with China. All it can do is destabilize and light fires all around China, light fires in the path of the Belt and Road Initiative, and do likewise to Russia and anyone who's partners with China. This is what we've seen. Angelo, you got anything else you want to add to that, especially regarding Syria and how Russia essentially they saved Syria?
Well, we can see. I'd like to compare what the U.S. did actually in Iraq and what Russia is doing now in Ukraine. You know, Iraq was about total destruction, and civilians. Was carpet bombing, really carpet bombing. What Russia is doing there is they are extremely careful. They don't want to have civilian losses, and even military losses on the other side. They see them as brothers. So what they want to do is right now, the strategy is to encircle them, and they aim surrender. They want surrender, because keep in mind that Russia is already preparing the next step. You know, they went to war to prepare peace. What they want, it's not creating a new enemy. In Iraq, in Afghanistan, what they created was 20 years of animosity, and they were hated. What Russia wants to do is just, bring peace. And later they are going to help reconstructing. You know, in 2014, Ukrainians, they were promised, EU, they promised help, they promised, Ukrainians, a lot of Ukrainians, you know what they bought? What idea they bought? Or maybe I'll be able to work in the EU. Well, you know what? 8 million people left to work in the EU as a slave labor. What did it do to your country? If you're Ukrainians, what did it do? You know, only old people stayed. You know, you had only old people stayed and neo-Nazis. So you see, Russia is there, and it's going to be there to do reconstruction. Real reconstruction. You know, on the other side, you had the U.S. How did it help Ukraine? By selling weapons and putting Ukraine in the debt trap, because this was the real debt trap. We see in the news many times. You see how many times they say, "Oh, we are helping Ukraine, we are sending weapons, or we are giving weapons." No, there is no giving. The US and the West doesn't give. It sells, and against a debt, that Ukraine is not going to be able to repay. That's what we call a debt trap. And it's like giving weapons so you kill yourself, and I don't have my blood spilled, because the new strategy is having mercenaries, is divide and conquer. You give weapons to the two sides and they kill each other, so you don't have to have boots on the ground. You know, the US did a mistake in Vietnam. It doesn't want to do that mistake again. So what they're doing is that proxy. You know, you finance what you put animosity in two parts and you make them fight. They want to do that between Ukraine and Russia. They want to do that between Taiwan and China.
And you were talking about Russia encircling these cities. This is actually what they did in Syria. They would encircle these cities. They would do precision strikes on military targets. They would just completely wipe out military logistics. And they would bring in, everyone remembers the green buses that was following that conflict. When the green buses came, that means it was basically done. And everyone, including militants who wanted to leave, they would be put on a green bus and sent to Idlib. And maybe we can put them on green buses and send them to Poland. Let Poland have these people that were fighting in Ukraine, that don't want to live in a peaceful Ukraine. I think there will be a reckoning with Idlib eventually. But that was the strategy, and that's what worked. That's how Syria regained control over all of its major cities. And I think that's what we're going to see in Ukraine. And again, like you were saying, the U.S. just was using full force against Iraq. They didn't even pretend they weren't. It was shock and awe. I have, because I was in the U.S. Marines, and I had people that I went through training with in Iraq following the lead invasion, and they were saying how they would just line up artillery and just shell it all day. Just to scare people. The whole thing was to shock them into surrender. That was the whole point. That's what the U.S. did in Iraq, and that is not what Russia is doing. And even the West is like, oh, they're not doing that. No, they didn't take Kiev overnight. The first day, Kiev didn't fall, so they failed. I mean, it's just so ridiculous. If you look at the population of Iraq back in 2003, I think it was like half of what Ukraine has, something like almost half of what Ukraine has now. And so it's just, and you have to remember that Iraq was periodically bombed by, first there was Desert Storm, and then through the Clinton years, it was periodically bombed. There were sanctions the entire time. And when the US finally went in, they had this massive force cutting through a country that they had tried to bury for over a decade. Ukraine, on the other hand, the U.S. has been trying to prop them up militarily, not economically, for sure. Their economy has been just gutted since 2014. But militarily and politically, they have been propping them up. So it's two completely different situations. And when you hear Western analysts saying that, oh, Russia is failing because they didn't take Kiev overnight, it's just so ridiculous. They're telling you that you're an idiot because they think you will believe that. And only an idiot would believe that. Someone who is extremely ignorant, or who doesn't care about the truth, wants to interpret that as failure. But I'm not going to draw any conclusions on how the operations in Ukraine will conclude, because you shouldn't do that unless you have solid evidence. And in the middle of a war, there's no way to do that. Angela, have you seen any interesting comments, or do you have anything else you want to add in?
No, I think same as you. I think the aim. I mean, what could happen is a surrender. I think I don't see Putin doing much compromise unless I mean he wants surrender, total surrender, and that's the goal. And he stated, you know, when he stated that he wants demilitarization and denazification, he wouldn't. I mean, why would he stop? You know, he's going to go all the way. You know, the damage. I mean. And I think people, you know, when you look at all the sanctions, they think that it was not well thought from Putin. Putin knew exactly what he was facing, and the sanctions. He knew exactly who he had in front of him. He had considered that. And you see, I think it's probably an agreement between Russia and China. So basically, China is going to help Russia. You know, it's going to they're going to buy products. And they are going to probably to help them to bypass sanctions. And the next step, I would expect that they are going to tie China to Russia and to demonize China and put sanctions on China. And that's the next step.
Yeah, This is going to, because the entire point of doing this with Russia is to get toward China. It's a chess game. The ultimate goal is stopping China, and so people shouldn't think that China is not, oh, they're not taking sides or something. I'm sure that they're fully aware of this. I think they're fully aware of this. I think they are going to very carefully, methodically, and unemotionally work their way through this with Russia, and try to get through this, and so humanity can getting on, because the West has been like a millstone around our neck for decades. People like to say that they're the ones pushing progress. No, they're not. They are the primary factor stagnating humanity in so many ways. And it would take a whole episode to explain why, but I just think of these deeply entrenched, corrupt, stagnant monopolies that rule over the West. Their fixation on hydrocarbons instead of moving towards other sources. The military-industrial complex, just feeding trillions of dollars into weapons of war and just knocking things down, building it up, and knocking things down. That is not progress. That is not progress. So it's time for change. It's time for multipolarism. We've got to stay united and stick together. I've never seen propaganda like this. The Western propaganda machine is in full swing. And if you think that this is bad, it is going to get worse once it comes time to dealing with China, provoking them and then demonizing the reaction when finally provoked. We will see this. I saw someone talk about Patrick Lancaster. I have been following his videos. The link to his video channel on YouTube is in the video description if you want to check that out. He is riding with Donetsk fighters westward out of the Donbas region, and I think they're going to link up with Russian forces or something. They're doing something, and he's riding with them, and he is showing you how the Ukrainian forces are shelling civilian areas, how they are kind of retreating, but it's like a fighting retreat. Where they're going, I don't know, and I don't know what the end game is. We just have to keep an eye on it. Angela, I'll give you the last say, and then we'll close things up for today.
No, well, just the usual. People need to stay critical. I think we need to manage with emotions. This is a very emotional time. It's we have a hard time just to on a day-to-day basis, especially when you are in places like you in Thailand and me right now in Switzerland. It's like people are so brainwashed, and whenever you go into a discussion, is that where do I start from? Because Mark Twain, there's a saying. Maybe I'll end up with a saying. Is that Mark Twain, he used to say, if you read the newspaper, you are. If you don't read the newspaper, you are uninformed. If you read the newspapers, you are misinformed. And that's the problem. It's like we are facing people uninformed or misinformed, and I don't know what is worse. I think it's better. I mean, it's easier with uninformed people, but there's so much pollution. I mean, they're polluting people. This whole brain is like, we just want to tell people, just wake up. Again, I'm not saying it's not about taking side here, but we want the truth to be exposed, really. And what we do, you and I, Brian, we're using Western media. I mean, all the time. We say this is the Western media, and those are the evidence. I mean, try to read through the lines. The information is all out there. Have a critical mind. It's not white and black. There's a gray area, and it's not. If it's simple, it's because you haven't thought that through. Geopolitics, it's complicated. You need to do the homework, and it's painful. It's painful. You use the term. It's going through a sewage. What is how do you say?
Yeah, it's like crawling in the dealing with the machinations of the Western world is like getting into a sewer every single day, crawling through sewage to find the clogs to get information flowing again. It is extremely unpleasant, exhausting, stressful. It is not. There's nothing fun about it at all.
Brian, I literally go take a shower after Inflection episodes because that, you know, I mean, mentally we are drained. We are drained because we don't like that. We don't enjoy it. We don't make money out of this. You know, it's dirty. And again, we are Westerners. It feels even dirtier. That's your family. You know, I'm supposed to be patriotic and love my country, and I do love my country. I just hate the system, you know, why it's an oppression of, you know, this sense of supremacy, because that's what it is, you know. It's like it hasn't changed. 500 years ago, we went to America, did a genocide, and we were going to teach them our way of thinking. It's the same now. What do we want to teach Russians, you know, with their history? What do we want to teach China with the history they have, you know? And those people are tired. They know, you know, the problems we have is that they know about us. We don't know about them. That's the problem. You know,
Absolutely.
The art of war. You mentioned this quite a few times, the art of war. Know yourself and know your enemy. Ignorance of the West is we don't know that we don't know. The West doesn't know that it doesn't know. And that's the worst thing. That's the worst thing. The next step, if you want a second level of wisdom, is you know that you don't know. At least awareness of ignorance, it's good. It's already good. It's like you start questioning things.
Yeah, and one last thing to just kind of throw out there, it's that when you're talking to people, and again, this is utterly exhausting. I like Carl Za. I don't know if anyone knows who he is. Check him out. He does excellent work.
Great.
He was doing these
Amazing.
marathon, like 10-hour-long Twitter spaces. And I don't even want to go in and listen, because if I go in and listen, he'll gang press me into being a co-host. And just some of these people, again, it's like some of them know that there's Nazis and they support the Nazis and they're too ashamed to come out and say it. Other people had absolutely no idea that there were Nazis, but they are so committed. Their ego is so invested into being on the next bandwagon passing by that they can't admit that they were wrong. But one good thing about this is that with any fad, with any trend, there is only a finite amount of time that it can sustain itself, and then it collapses. People get tired, people get bored, and I can guarantee you that the resolve of Russian troops will outlast the popularity of this trend and getting your little Ukraine flag in your profile picture. Russian resolve is going to outlast that. I think the West knows that. So what it really is a race to exploit this window where everyone is just hysterical and foaming at the mouth and rabid versus Russia before that fades, to get something going. And I don't know what that will be, but this is an incredibly dangerous period of time. And then if and when they pivot this toward toward China, it'll become even more dangerous. And I just cannot, like, there's almost certainly going to be a conventional war fought in the Pacific between US and Chinese naval vessels, and it might escalate beyond there. We just have to be really careful about this whole situation. I think we're gonna put a pin in it for today. We will try to keep an eye on this. If anything, big happens, Angelo, you've said that you will jump on, and we could do another broadcast. To everyone who has tuned in, thank you very much. Thank you for all of the support. When you're getting support at a time like this from people, it means so much more, because it's so much more stressful, and the Western media wants you to feel isolated. And so when you're receiving support from people and kind comments, people are helping share the work, supporting my work, this all means so much to me. It really is what makes it possible to do. And it also reminds you why it's worth doing, that there's other good people out there, and that you're not alone, and that this isn't hopeless. So until next time, bye for now.
Bye.